Welcome everyone who is already here. We are going to give 1 or 2 minutes before we start. Super. I'm going to start and then people can join while I'm introducing today's program. So a very warm welcome to everyone and thank you very much for joining us. And we are sorry that we couldn't meet in person. I hope that better times will come. I'm still quite optimistic. So thank you very much for joining this seminar entitled Weapons After War, the Symbolism of Disarmament. This seminar was organized by Nicholas Marsh and myself. And a big thank you for Indigo, who helped us with the technical details for today's seminar. This event is part of a series organized by PRIO Center on Culture and Bioland Conflict and the Norwegian Research Council funded Disarm project. So in today's meeting, we will focus on the disarmament of non-state actors in the aftermath of civil conflicts. This is a process which in the past few decades has become a common feature of peace-building programs undertaken by the UN or other regional organizations. We know from research that disarmament is both a technical and a symbolic process, yet most of this research focuses on the technical aspects of this undertaking, while in reality, for example, mediators often spend a considerable amount of time negotiating various symbolic aspects of disarmament with the conflict parties. Now, symbolism can appear in different places throughout this process, for example, in the language used for the disarmament, the handover as disarmament takes place, or the use of weapons after the post-agreement phase. And despite the importance of the symbolic aspects of disarmament, we know very little about how discussions on these aspects influence the overall peace negotiations, what non-state actors disarmament symbolizes for different groups, such as civilians, women, or ex-combatants, or the different meanings that weapon can have in the aftermath of civil conflicts. And during today's seminar, we are having 3 experts with us who are going to help us to unpack these questions and related aspects and share their expertise with various aspects of the symbolism of disarmament. And now I'm going to hand over the word to Nick, who is going to introduce our speakers.
Thanks very much, Julia. I will introduce them all very briefly so that we can have lots of time for discussion. So the first speaker will be Peter Brune, the Managing Director of War Child Sweden. And he'll be talking about his experiences in a previous position as well. Then we'll have Francesco Buscemi, he's a researcher currently at the Aino Adi Foundation in Turin in Italy. And finally, we'll hear from Vanessa Farr, who's a research associate at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. So without further ado, I can hand over to Peter. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Nick, and great to be in this meeting with you. I will make a very short introduction and then we'll watch a video, 1.5 minutes, and then I'll continue with my presentation. Many thanks to Prio. It's such an important institute, not least for War Child, because we take very much of our numbers from what we get from Prio and the analysis on children affected by armed conflict. But what I'm going to talk about today is a very concrete disarmament initiative called Humanium Metal. And I think, it's an opportunity to look at this video first, and then I will say a few more words, and then we can have a brief discussion on it. So please, Julia, if you can show this video, or Indigo.
Yes, just 1 second.
Humanium is a new metal made from destructed illegal firearms. Armed violence is a global epidemic with over 500 million illegal firearms across the world. One person is shot and killed every minute, and developing countries suffer the most. But time can change that. The Triva Humanium watch is made from destructed illegal firearms, crafted out of something that used to be a destructive force, now turned into something useful.
The general idea of the Humanium Metal Initiative is perfect. Just the knowledge of this coming from a deadly weapon is extremely powerful. To use the symbolic value of a watch to raise awareness of this critical ethical message is super important for us. The watch industry is too focused on status and precious metals. If we can take away the precious metals and bring something like this into the watches that has a much stronger symbolic value, then we've done our job.
The sales from the watches generate financial resources used to rebuild conflict-torn societies and support victims of armed violence. The Humanium Metal Initiative by IM Swedish Development Partner is supported by local governments and authorities, and some of the most renowned international experts and peace advocates. There's no gimmick here, just a new watch, made from destructed firearms to fight violence and poverty. It's time for peace.
Good, thank you. I was working 2008 to 2010 with something called CASAC, Central American Small Arms Control. It's still there, but it's now more than 10 years ago. So, but those 2 years, I was involved in a UN initiative to disarm the Central American region post-conflict. Many of the Central American countries had gone through periods of armed violence, and there's a lot of arms around, firearms around. And we were a team of some 4 or 5 people that should promote disarmament in different ways. And one of the examples, one of the initiatives, one of the wings of this initiative was to also do symbolic destructions. Not the most important one, but still, we traveled around Latin America. We took seized firearms and destroyed them, simply kind of cutting them into pieces. And then what were we going to do with the remains of the firearms? So, once you destroy a weapon, it's still technically a weapon. It's a whole range of different arrangements around that. So the simplest solution was simply to take a boat and go into the Pacific Ocean and dump it into the ocean. For me, that sounded a bit weird, but that's what we were instructed to do. And we asked the UN Environment Institute, and they said, that's okay, it's good steel, the coral reefs actually grow on that, etc. But still, I had this idea of, can't you do anything else with the metal? And that is where I came back to Sweden, and I tried to get different actors on board, say, hey, can we do something with the remains of destroyed firearms? As such, that's nothing new. Already in the Bible, it's been talked about converting swords into plowshares. So the idea of conversion is not new. But humanium was new in 2 aspects. The first aspect was that we gave it a name. this metal, we called it in the beginning the most valuable metal in the world, or even the most expensive, because well, it was so expensive because it costed lives, this metal, before it was transformed into uranium. But we gave it a name, uranium. All the metal from all over the world that is destroyed could technically become uranium. And by the way, we need still new countries, places where we can let's say mine uranium. There's a desperate need of more uranium in the world. The second important aspect besides the name is that we didn't do the product ourselves. That has also been made a number of times, very good initiatives, either pieces of art or also kind of things as such out of this destroyed metal. But we said, well, I mean, all the attempts by the peace movement to produce things, often it doesn't work. You sit there with a lot of stuff on your shelves and nobody wants to buy it in the end, etc. So we said, well, we will make this metal available for those who can do something with it. There are a number of different products available now made from these destroyed firearms, and we can share the link to the website to the organization, my previous employer, who is in charge of this project. There are watches, there are pens, there are other stuff you can buy. But it is not us who produce it, but there's also a meaning to it, in my understanding, that we are not the ones who must bring all these issues to the market. It is producers who say, well, we think there is a value for us to say that, well, we believe in this product. We know it contributes not only to awareness raising and sales and revenues for the conflict-torn societies, but also actually a shift in attitude. You show that, well, I dislike the prevalence of, let's say, the Central American arms culture, or the American, or wherever there is an armed culture that kills people massively. And we want to change that behavior, that attitude. It's not cool to have a weapon. It's on the contrary, it's very uncool. And that is why we reach out to private sector companies who can sell our stuff. And it's working well. I can talk for hours about different challenges and opportunities related to uranium. But I think I'd rather also take questions from your side on what you perceive and different challenges. So I open up for question, Nick, or whoever is moderating this. But I can, if you want, talk for hours. But maybe there are questions also for clarification, simply.
That's fine. Yes. Is there an echo? We had planned on having questions at the end, but there's no problem if we can see if any members of the audience would like to write a question, perhaps in the chat, or you can raise your hand, or I can.
Up to you. I can give more dimensions to this if you want. And I don't know how much time I have left before I should hand over to the next person here.
Well, you could have a couple more minutes. I mean, maybe if you could give us an idea of, if you've got an idea of some of the impact it has. Have you seen people wearing the materials, things like that?
One thing that is very important to keep in mind here is that we are only taking metal from illegally used firearms. We are not saying that we want to destroy every firearm for sports shooting or taking away all weapons from military. No, the basic idea is to say that, well, we only take weapons that have been seized by a relevant authority. It could be the police or other authorities that seize the firearm and instructs them to be destroyed. And it's only the remains of the illegally destructed firearms that we use here. This is very important because you would have, not least in the US, the whole National Rifle Association chasing you, saying, well, these people are breaching our Second Amendment, blah, blah, blah. No, we can all, and I've met a number of them over the years, where you say, well, do you think illegally used firearms should not be destroyed? And some of them say, yes, we don't think they should be destroyed, but you take away a very strong argument by using that, saying, these are illegal firearms and we want to take them off the market, and we use the sales of uranium to help the affected societies. The key country here, and coming to the impact, has been El Salvador, which with a very high level of armed violence and many killings a year. I think the average in Sweden is 1 per 100,000 people killed. In El Salvador, it's around 60. So it's times 60 the number of people killed, actually. And that is where you also must start to see, how do we see that there is an impact in the behavior? Because we want to also limit the demand simply. I mean, a little bit bluntly, when a girl in El Salvador turns 15, she is handed out kind of very kind of, well, even sexy underwear, saying, well, now you're 15 years old, now you're a grown up. A boy turning 15 gets a firearm, saying, well, now you're a real man, now you get your first firearm. And those are the attitudes we want to change. And that you don't change by kind of putting up posters or imposing even more strict laws. That's also an important part. But we need to work on the attitude and the behavior behind it.
Yeah, thanks very much, Peter. There was a couple of questions, but I think you've answered some of them incidentally. There was someone asking about whether it was related to NATO, but I think you've clarified that. And we can go into some of the questions after the end of the presentations. So I think we can now. So thank you very much for everything you said there, Peter. I think we can now hand over to Francesco Buscemi, and we can come back to some of these issues at the end. Okay, Francesco, thank you.
Hi, Nick. Let me just. Can you hear me well in the meeting?
I can hear you. You're quite quiet, so maybe if you could try speaking loudly.
A bit loudly. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, and the screen is shared right now, or?
Yep.
Okay. So good morning, everybody, and thanks so much for being connected. Thanks also to Julia and Nick for the invitation and for organizing the event. My work up to now, which right now, as Nick was saying, is based at the Einaudi Foundation in Turin, has been focusing mostly on the processes and practices of controlling weapons and armed collectives, and then how these processes and practices contribute to produce political geographies of rule and orders at the edge of state authority. In particular, I have been focusing on the borderlands of Myanmar, and today I thought to present a brief excerpt of a paper on which I'm working that touches upon the symbolism nested in a process of ceasefire, disarmament, and then later on rearmament of a rebel movement in Myanmar. Just to provide a very quick overview, I will first of all say some words to contextualize the rebel movement I worked with and also the context in which they operated. Then I will sketch briefly the symbolism of the ceasefire decade and the disarmament ceremony and process. And then lastly, I will explain how political logics that originated from or can be reconducted to the decades of ceasefire and disarmament have been materialized in the formation of a new armed group when the rebel movement rearmed. And I will do so especially by looking at the hat and the badges of the uniform of the new armed group. I will do all of this trying to guiding you through the pages of April 2005 edition of the Global New Light of Myanmar, which is a military-run newspaper, so a newspaper run by the military regime in Myanmar. So basically with the presentation, I'm bringing you to Tang areas of northern Shan State at the extended borderland between Myanmar and China, where since the 60s, different rebel movements of the Tang ethno-nationality have been fighting the military state governments and at times also other rebel movements with a view to obtain some form of political and economic self-determination in a democratic federation of Myanmar. And the ethno-nationalism underpinning these movements has to be located in a broader scenario of an ethnocentric nation and state building project that has been conducted by the military state authorities of the Tatmadaw, which is the Myanmar army, with the view to integrate the so-called national races of the Myanmar polity. Essentially, the idea is that the military state sees the Myanmar as a polity composed by different national races, and that these national races have always been living in harmony. The window closed. Yeah, these national races have always been living in harmony, but this harmony was disrupted by colonialism and capitalist domination, and the military sees itself in the role of bringing together all these nationalities. And for these reasons, ethno-nationalism has acquired a great deal of political capital in Myanmar. For example, for the Tang ethnic communities have been defined by the military state with another name, that is Palang, and they have been included into another major national race in the Myanmar polity. And it's interesting to note how the armed group, the first armed group, when it formed, used the exonym Palang rather than its own endonym, so the name Tang. So as I was saying, the Palang State Liberation Organization agreed to a ceasefire in 1991 with the military state government, but soon part of the movement disagreed with this decision and decided to form a political front based at the Thai-Burma border, so away from the borderlands between Myanmar and China, and to continue struggle only politically, so without forming an armed group. And the decades that followed the ceasefire for the state were characterized by different frontierization and territorialization projects and moments which were connected to intensive poppy cultivation and narcotics trade, to infrastructural extractive projects, and also to transformations in the local production and trade of tea, which is a main livelihood means here. And all of these developments generated phenomena like population displacement, land and resources grabs, and an overall militarization, which connected with the diffusion of drug addiction, led to a sense among Tang populations of being targeted by a genocide and mass violence project led by the military state vis-a-vis Tang populations. In 2005, the movement was forced to disarm as part of a series of broader political and economic reforms, and under a program that was called the exchange of arms for peace. Essentially here, the idea of the military state was that as Myanmar was undertaking a series of political reforms towards the adoption of a new constitution and towards perhaps in the future a semi-democratic transition, then armed groups did not need their weapons anymore, especially those that had agreed to a ceasefire, and they could freely and unconditionally exchange them for peace. And this symbolism of the exchange of arms for peace was then found also in the ceremony of the disarmament, because on the one hand of the parade ground where the ceremony was carried out were placed the weapons to be handed over, and on the other hand of the parade ground instead were placed bags of rice and packages of edible oil, which for the military government symbolized both a donation and a symbol of prosperity and harmony for the future, but also the commodities that were most commonly looted by the rebel movement vis-a-vis its own population. Opposite was not only the position of the two set of commodities and technical objects on the parade ground, but also the let's say the following paths that they had in the aftermath of the disarmament, because the rice and edible oil were simply returned to wholesalers and vendors from which the military government had borrowed these commodities just for the sake of the ceremony, and instead the weapons were not destroyed, but they were stored and then recycled by the Tatmadaw, which distributed them to militias that it formed after the disarmament. And the symbology of this ceremony had also to do with this idea of this exchange of arms for peace as a last step in a process undertaken by the rebel movement to return to a so-called legal fold. And here again we go back to the idea of the Tatmadaw and the military state being the authorities that take care of the integration and unity of all these national races into a Myanmar polity. But of course, very different ideas were held by the political front at the Thai-Burma border that had rejected disarmament and that had rejected the ceasefire and rejected also the disarmament at this point, and that started a process of rearmament which culminated in 2009 with the formation of a new armed group. And here I will end by looking at the hat and the badges of the uniform of the armed group, in which we can see how these logics of ethno-nationalism, which underpinned both the decades of the ceasefire and the disarmament process, were rematerialized in the formation of the new armed group. Nick, just to check in, how many minutes am I left with? Just to...
I think you're okay with about 3 minutes.
Okay. So first of all, the hat. Basically, the hat was they adopted a hat that had already been adopted in a very similar style by the previous rebel movement, and they sort of established a symbolic connection in the past with the previous armed formations of the Tang ethno-nationality, and on the other hand also with the a connection between the new armed formation and the Tang populations scattered across different areas of Myanmar. And you can see maybe in the hat there's a horizontal band that connects the right extremity with the left extremity of the hat, which symbolizes this sort of connection between the new armed formation and Tang populations. And on the other hand also a band that runs along the circumference of the hat itself, which would symbolize the idea of the armed group standing around and delimiting and somehow also reforming a sort of an ethnogenesis of the population. And then the two badges of the new uniform, starting from the right, well, for me, right, in any case, it's the right arm badge, which shows two swords, which are traditional swords of the Tang communities, and that symbolize both the idea of the Tang unknown soldier and all the befallen soldiers and people that were killed by the military state. And on the other hand, the two traditionals would symbolize also the idea of rejecting any form of handover of the weapons, even if this would entail to fight with traditional swords. And then on the, and I will conclude on the left arm badge, which depicts a series of three mountains, which are surrounded by tea leaves, and at the center a tea flower. And the mountains and the tea leaves represent a symbolic connection to the historical legacy of these populations in producing and trading tea, mostly in the northern parts of Myanmar, but at the same time symbolizes also a rejection of geographical limitations and political limitations framed by the military state that would limit Tang areas to specific geographic locations in Myanmar, and instead tries to go beyond that and look at populations of the Tang minority that live elsewhere. And finally, there is also a sun which towers these mountains, which again is a symbology of a rejection of the ethnocentric depictions by the military state of the Tang population. So I will end it here, and thanks so much for the attention.
Thanks very much, Francesco. Yeah, certainly those kind of ceremonies of disarmament are things which are found very commonly in other parts of the world. Yes, it's a kind of an extreme version when both the arms and all the other products are then moved off to other things, recycled. So I'd now like to hand over to Vanessa Farr. Yep, there you are.
Am I there?
Yep.
Hi, can you hear me clearly?
I can hear you and see you.
Great. Hi, everybody. Thank you very much to Julia and Nick for this interesting conversation and for inviting me to be part of it. I will speak to a PowerPoint, so I'll just put that up now. You can let me know if it's showing up. Where is it?
Don't see it yet.
Sorry, hang on a sec. I'll get there. These things always take longer than you want them to. There we go. That up and running. I am just getting a logo here on this side. Can you see it where you are?
I can just see you.
Yeah.
If you'd like me to run the PowerPoint
Indigo,
for
will you?
Vanessa.
Yeah, will you run it, please? Because
Of course.
oh, hang on, it's loading up. Hang on, it's doing its thing. It's having a think. Is it there? Sorry, I'm not completely accustomed to.
Yep, I can see it now.
Is it there?
Yep.
I still don't see it. I see it loading, but I don't see any actual image. The slides will appear when they're ready, is what it says. Anyway, while it's thinking about what it's doing, Indigo, can you see it yet?
Yeah, I can see it on there. So it looks like we can see it at least.
Okay, now is it going to allow me to? Can you see it as a whole list of things, or does it just show up? I'm not familiar with.
No notes for you. No,
looks
no.
okay. Okay, great. Sorry, I've never used a PowerPoint on Teams before. So I thought I would move the conversation in a very different direction, and I hope you will bear with me as I explain to you that one of the reasons for me talking about the subject that I will discuss today is that having worked as a feminist on disarmament for the last 20-something years, I'm always astonished by how we try to say old things in new ways, because really I think the work that we've been trying to do as a disarmament community has become dishearteningly difficult. And the optimism that perhaps one felt a few years ago seems just to be less and less met in the world by responsiveness from those who should be more responsible about disarmament. So, as I often do when I feel rather sad and desperate about what I can say and how I can say it, I just went back to one of my favorite, very old feminist thinkers. A wonderful South African proto-feminist writer called Olive Schreiner, of whom some of you might have heard. She very famously wrote a book called The Story of an African Farm. And in 1911, she published a book that she reconstructed painfully after it was destroyed, in fact, during the Civil War, the first one of the civil wars in South Africa against British colonialism, which is known here as the Anglo-Boer War. Her entire manuscript, in fact, her house was destroyed, and she patiently reconstructed it. And I first found this book when I was working, heaven knows how, 2.5 decades ago, on a master's thesis, where I was looking at women's experiences of armed conflict and what they might say about it. And it has stayed with me so powerfully and resonated so powerfully over the last 25 years that I go back again and again to the chapter in the book, Woman and Labour, on Woman and War, where she says, and I'll just read it along with you, men have made boomerangs, bows, swords, or guns with which to destroy one another. We have made the men who destroyed or were destroyed. We have in all ages produced at great cost the primal munition of war, without which no other would exist. There is no battlefield on earth, or ever has been, howsoever covered with the slain, which it has not cost the woman of the race more in actual bloodshed and anguish to supply than it has cost the men who lie there. We pay the first cost of all human life. Even in the matter of death, the probability that the average woman will die in childbirth is immeasurably greater than the probability that the average man will die in battle. And this piece, this excerpt, is significantly more poignant, I think, when you realize that Schreiner herself only had a single child in her entire life. And that little girl lived a day. So she was born very sickly and she was dead by the next day, which was not an anomalous experience for a woman in the 1860s. However, what does this mean for us? So, you know, a century and a half later, I thought I would have a look at Afghanistan as a case study of where I think the symbolism, the actuality of disarmament should really be taking us all. You might recall, those of you who were engaged in thinking about Afghanistan and disarmament all those years ago, that George W. Bush very proudly announced to the world that the fight against terrorism in Afghanistan is also a fight for the rights and dignity of women. And I don't know if you recall, as I do, the incredible outcry that came from the feminist community at the time, who said, never in the history of the world has there ever been an instance in which women are liberated at the pointed end of a gun, and you will not succeed in what you claim to be doing now. And yes, of course, the voices of feminists are never heard, and we were similarly not heard then. And so here we sit 20 years later, with around 638 per 100,000 women dying giving birth in Afghanistan. This is one of the highest maternal mortality rates in the world. And I don't know how many of you have ever thought about disarmament in terms of maternal mortality rates, but it is one of my favorite tricks to play. When people start to talk to me about how successful disarmament is, simply say, have you looked at the maternal mortality rates in the country which you're proudly claiming to have made a contribution to in terms of peace? There, for me, is a crux of what we should be looking at. Olive Schreiner's insight that the weight in blood and sweat and pain and suffering that women have to bear in order to produce those children in the first place is something that we can, in fact, I think, begin to measure in terms of the incredible costliness of the proliferation of weapons. One of the things that we know that is really startling about Afghanistan is that there are around 105 adult men per 100 women. And I can think of no other country on earth where, after 4 decades of war, which one would associate normally, as precisely as Schreiner says, with the slain bodies of men dying in battlefields, of such an enormous discrepancy between the numbers of adult men and the numbers of adult women. Normally, after the end of a war, you would see a significant bulge of women or number of women who are left widowed or otherwise unpartnered through the deaths of men, or unfathered, unhusbanded, unbrothered, unsunned. But in Afghanistan, adult men significantly outnumber adult women. So why? What are some of the reasons that we might begin to work out why this country has such a dreadfully high maternal mortality rate? The 2018 health expenditure for Afghanistan, and I might remind you that the 2018 that in 2018 in Afghanistan, around 80% of government spending was entirely donor-driven money. So this gives you a little bit of an idea of where the donor community was actually really interested in putting its attention. It was a minuscule $1,853 million US. This was at a point in the history of Afghanistan where the war was heading up towards this extraordinary figure of about $8 trillion being spent on it overall, which we now are able to calculate through that 20-year period of US military occupation. And Brown University, which comes up with the 8 trillion fee, also says that around 900,000 people are presumed to have died as a result of war violence. But of course, what that number does not tell us is the numbers of women and girls who died in childbirth. And I say girls advisedly for Afghanistan because one of the responses of that suffering community, which practices exogenous marriage, where women move to the family of the man to whom they're marrying, is that girls are betrothed in marriage at younger and younger ages. And the expectation in a war zone, one of the methods through which people attempt to keep the honor of the family alive, if not the actual body of the girl, is to give her in marriage at increasingly young ages. And the expectation then is that the child will be fertile and basically as soon as she's able, as soon as her body is able, she will start to produce children. And there's an incredible amount of callousness that seems to arise around this. I remember being told in Afghanistan, when talking to women health workers with whom I worked over a significant period of time, that one of the things that they had noticed was that families would have a knock on the door, the front door, as the dead body of the mother and the baby who had just died in the house were carried out the back door. And somebody would be knocking at the front door saying, we hear that you need a new daughter-in-law in this household, and we've got a daughter that if you've got dowry, we've got a daughter. So there was an incredible sort of callousness about this high loss of life in childbirth. So that number of 900,000, in other words, is not I would say, in any way an accurate estimation of who has died as a result of this war, because it doesn't include the numbers of girls and women who died. And it doesn't, of course, include the numbers of female children and infants who've been allowed to die. Because again, if a family is making a decision about where the food will go, it usually does not go to the girls. I remember a very shocking, personally shocking moment of speaking to somebody who had just been in an infant emergency feeding center where twin children were brought in, one boy and one girl, at about the age of about 8 or 10 weeks, and they were chronically malnourished. But the little boy was about double the size of his sister because he had been offered whatever breast milk was available. And then the sister was given, the little girl was given the empty breast to suckle on. And so even though both children were in a state of desperate malnutrition, the boy was comparatively significantly better off than his sister. These are the kinds of practical on-the-ground realities of what I'm talking about when I say that decisions are made in wartime that are fundamentally and profoundly unjust. But I thought what I might do now is talk to you a little bit about what's been happening in the USA in a similar period of time, because I think this is one of the most important things to think about when we think about the symbolism of disarmament, and perhaps something that hasn't come up today. Who produces the weapons? For what profit? What is their purpose in producing them? What is their purpose in allowing them to endlessly circulate? What is the purpose in devising more and more lethal and easier to use weapons systems? And so I wanted to take our attention back to the USA, the military industrial complex that has been running the show in Afghanistan for the last 20 years, supposedly, remember, in the interests of women and girls. It turns out that the most weaponized country in the world is also the deadliest developed country in which to give birth. And the USA's maternal mortality rate has steadily risen since 2000. It's now at an astounding 17 per 100,000. And of course, racialized and impoverished women are massively overrepresented in that number. I thought I'd give you as a comparison Norway, which has for the last 20 years or so been relatively consistently around 2 in 100,000. Possibly 3 in 100,000. It fluctuates maybe by, you know, 1 person per annum per 100,000. You might want to note that this decline coincides with the USA's longest and costliest wars. And, you know, is it coincidence, in fact, that more women die in childbirth in the USA now than they did 20 years ago? It's also quite interesting to notice that the USA is the only high-income country in the world that does not guarantee paid leave to mothers after childbirth. And if you want to have a look at that rather astonishing chart, I'm not sure how clearly you can see it, but the average maternity leave in Norway is 91 weeks, and in the US it is none at all. So if you'd like to kind of think about this in terms of absolute spending, Norway fluctuates. It goes up and down between about 1.9 and 2% of its GDP on military spending for the last 20 years. Nick, correct me if that's wrong, but that was what I picked up off the World Bank site. And the USA has fluctuated between 3 to 5% of its GDP. So one might start to think about where that money, where those decisions are going, why those decisions are being made by men, of course, who are profiting vastly from the production of these arms. And none of it is going into healthcare. None of it is going towards saving women from death, preventable death in childbirth, usually easily preventable. You might also want to notice that one of the things the USA is doing, and this is a frightening thing to see as a feminist, not because I want to jump into difficult arguments about whether or not women should be allowed to terminate pregnancies that they don't want, but because there is significant and striking evidence that's been collected over many, many decades, particularly in the USA, that shows us that women are freely allowed to terminate unwanted pregnancies. The rates of incarceration and armed violence particularly decline massively in the years following that freedom. So there was a window of opportunity before this huge return to war in 2000. There was a period of about 1980 to about 2000 in which American women did have better access to healthcare services, including abortions, where they were not producing unwanted babies, and where armed violence struggles in inner cities were significantly different as a result. So again, one wants to think about, I think, those connections between wanted babies, babies that can be looked after, mothers that know how to take care of those children, and what those children might do if there are prolific arms around for them to pick up and misuse. So for me, the most important and the most significant impact of disarmament would be, both symbolically and in reality, a world in which women were healthy and safe, where they were free and they were happy, where they were protected and nourished during their pregnancies, which is when the fetus is developing all of its nervous systems and all of its brain. And we now know that the barrier between the placenta and the child is not sufficient to protect a child from more toxins. We know that epigenetically, intergenerational violence is passed through the mother to her baby before it is even born. And we know that the health consequences of being born from a mother who is exposed to the toxins of war are lifelong. The mother would receive high quality postnatal support. She would be able to love and look after her baby. She would be able to, in the words of neuroscientists like Stephen Porges, develop a child whose nervous system gave it an incredible capacity to deal with the shocks of life, including, it is proven, being able to resist being drawn into violence. I don't know if you've noticed, but there is a tremendous increase in the amount of rhetoric that is now being spoken about the prevention of violent extremism in young men, as if this is something that you can start to do when they turn 18 or 19 or 20 years old, when they come from broken mothers and devastated fathers who have not been able to look after them or give them any of the care that they need to be functioning, flourishing human beings. And this is important to us, of course. It is important to all of us who work on disarmament, because this is the purpose of what we do. We want to create a world in which humans can flourish, in which humans and non-humans can flourish. And we are not achieving this. We are very far from achieving this. The first disarmament has to be the disarmament of the mind, and we have to address the misogyny behind what we are doing when we allow arms to proliferate. I'll conclude with that beautiful poster from 1967. This was made the year before I was born. That too strikes me as powerful. War is not healthy for children and other living things. And here we are in the COVID pandemic, where so many of us have lost people we love and are losing people we love because we cannot take care of the most important thing in the world, which is our precious human bodies. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, which leaves me somewhat speechless. All I can say is you were completely within, centrally within all the fine traditions of peace research in raising all of those issues. So for some discussion, I can hand over to Julia, who will be doing that side of it.
Thank you very much, Vanessa, Francesco, and Peter. I think it was very interesting to hear these three quite different aspects, and we certainly have not exhausted everything that is connected to this wide umbrella, to the symbolism of disarmament. So we have received quite a few questions in the chat, but I will be very attentive to the time. So we have 9 minutes. And I'm going to start asking the questions in a chronological order, and please write in more questions, and apologies if there won't be any time for all questions, but it's just, I don't know, as Peter was saying, we can talk about these things for hours. So I think the first question, I would put together two questions from two attendees and pose it to Peter, but I would also like to invite Francesco or Vanessa if they have anything to add. So one speaker is asking that from which parts of the world do the firearms come from for the Humanium project, but you alluded to that what kind of products are made of that. So I think you can also maybe we will share the link to the website so people can read up more on this. And then what I also find interesting is this wider environment, which very closely ties to Vanessa's perspective, is that what has been the response or the reaction of communities where weapons were used for the Humanium project? If you can reflect a little bit on these, that would be great. Thank you, Peter.
Yeah. So the main country so far to provide us with Humanium is El Salvador. But we are trying to get additional weapons from Brazil, and other places. Zambia has also started to produce some Humanium, seized firearms where the remains are handed over to Humanium. And actually, just recently, a small police department in the US, this is only a month ago, said that they destroyed firearms in the US in that specific police department. I don't remember now because I am not connected that way any longer to it, but has started to produce Humanium. And that is a major breakthrough because America, the US is so important, not least for setting the standards on how you view firearms. But many more countries should join and reach out to the team currently working at Humanium and invite them, Jacqueline, Simon, and others. They desperately need more Humanium. Sorry, the second part of the question, what was it?
Sorry, the second part of the question was the reaction of communities.
Yes, yeah, exactly. No, I mean, the relationship to firearms is very emotional. For some people, it's really part of their identity to be carrying weapons. Yeah? A real hero in this regard is a guy, Amilcar Duran, who was shot and injured and ended up in a wheelchair. He always went to communities in El Salvador that would be far too dangerous for me to go to as a foreigner, but he went there. And the kids in the community said, oh, you know, we end up in one of the following three places, either in the graveyard or the hospital or in the prison. And he always told them, going to these really dangerous communities, saying, you know, guys, you know, kids, there's a fourth place where you can end up, and that's in this wheelchair as well. Don't go there. I've lived this experience. So you have to take it step by step and change the attitude. Then I couldn't agree more than, I mean, I've worked very much with Afghanistan and a feminist approach. I think these are really important components to also work on, and maybe that's actually something good for Humanium to apply a more feminist approach to what to do this. I mean, these were convincing figures on Afghanistan and what do we do with our bodies, and apply a much more feminist logic that might be a much more powerful way forward. But I mean, these efforts can be combined as well. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Peter. And I think I'm just going to pose the last question that we received from the audience, and we can conclude with that. So if Vanessa and Francesco can briefly answer to the question, which was, is there any example of countries or organizations that integrated in their DDR disarmament programs a dimension related to the masculinity attached to weapons? So was there a disarmament of masculinities attached to any kind of disarmament program? I think this is a very nice question to end the conversation with. So Vanessa, please, if you have anything.
Yeah, thank you, Alice, for that question. Yes, it's become a sort of, you know, a standard trope of the United Nations, particularly that masculinity is one of the most important things we have to take on when we look at disarmament. There was a very interesting piece of work conducted through CSAC, the Southeast Europe Small Arms Collection Process, which lasted for a number of years. There's feedback on the line. Sorry. And it did look very particularly and in very, and I think fairly effective ways at why it is particularly that men want to take up arms. But it certainly for the first 10 or so years that I was involved in disarmament work, the big struggle really was to try to correct the misapprehension that was circulating at the time that women and children are the most, you know, the most significant victims of small arms violence, which of course is just not empirically true. Men kill one another with weapons, and they, of course, brutalize and terrorize women in the process. But, you know, so masculinity, or, you know, the sort of patriarchal, military-industrial patriarchal complex in which we are all caught and in which we're all suffering, is so significantly attached to the notions of sort of technologization as masculinity, you know, the more and more efficient and effective strike bombs, et cetera, that we're constantly being told are being developed. That, you know, if you're not thinking about masculinity, then you aren't really thinking about disarmament. So it's a bit of a difficult question to answer, but effectively, yes, you do have to understand what the normative frameworks are from which people are coming, why it is so important to men to carry the weapons of destruction around with them and to deploy them, and in what ways men who don't take up arms are pilloried or embarrassed or, you know, violated. And so, you know, how is it that the whole of society can actually bring its attention to why there are these particular sort of outliers, male outliers, you might say? There's a lot of really interesting somatic thinking to be done about this. Which is, you know, largely to do with understanding what happens to men who have dysfunctional or not present mothers, and particularly dysfunctional and not present fathers. So again, you know, I don't want to sort of give you a too vague answer, but there are so many different angles from which we should be thinking about masculinities, and I think a tendency in many of the world's leading organizations to be sort of a bit a bit superficial in what they're actually trying to attempt to do when they talk about masculinity. I hope that's helpful.
Wonderful and quite depressing at the same time as these topics usually are when we start delving into them. Thank you, Vanessa. Francesco, if you want to close this wonderful and very interesting discussion with reflecting on these issues or answering this question, that would be very much appreciated.
Thanks so much, Julia, for the honor. No, I don't have clear answers on these points because I feel like they were raised on a more practitioner-oriented dimension. But I have a few things that I think I can say on femininity and masculinity. I would say that in the case that was part of my research, femininity and masculinity were very much mobilized by the rebel movement in the rearmament process by, for example, finding a consensus among women as an entry point into households because of a situation in which, due to drug addiction and the intensive cultivation of poppy and narcotics trade, basically all or the majority of men had either migrated or been recruited by militias or they ended up being drug addiction issues. And therefore the rearmament process of the rebel movement very much worked through finding consensus with women in households. So I think this is in a sense it's also interesting of how these femininity and masculinity dynamics play out. And then I've had in the past a working experience with CSAC, and while I completely agree with the importance of the issue of femininity, I also remember that at least when I was working there, there was a bit of a tendency also to use these like the keyword of gender as a hook to find funding with the EU. So I'm not criticizing anybody or even the introduction of femininity or gender in Disarmament, but I was just reasoning about how, about the importance of placing all these question marks that we raised today in a very serious manner. And then the last point, which I found a bit, I think, while we were speaking, has to do with the tension between legality and illegality, and instead, on the other hand, this issue of looking at the modalities of violence and how the modalities of violence are codified into ways of killing, which also have to do with ways of producing weapons, what kind of weapons are produced, and so on. Because I think that the distinction between legal and illegal does not lead maybe so far. For example, if I think about my case, the question would be also like, what's the fate of the weapons that are seized by rebel movements, for example, which in theory are produced by the Myanmar state, which is a bit, let's say, self-sufficient when it comes to weapons production. But at the end of the day, those are clearly, well, at least from an ethical point of view, illegal weapons, because they are used by an ethnocentric state to let's say, colonize, just to put it very harshly, other parts of the country. So I think the legal-illegal issue is maybe very useful and practical because of course one needs also to implement programs. But at the end of the day, as I think it emerged from Vanessa's presentation, maybe the important point is to see how violence is codified into weapons and ways of killing and of affecting the bodies and so on.
Yeah.
From animals to other beings.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you very much to all three of you. I thought I've read quite a lot about this topic, but I am certainly nowhere. Now I recognize. It was super interesting, all these perspectives. Thank you very much for taking the time. Thank you very much for the audience who posed excellent questions and followed the entire discussion. We are very grateful that you turned up. And then, sorry for running over with 3 minutes, but I wish you a wonderful day. And thank you very much again for the speakers. It was an honor to have you all here. And thank you, Nick, for moderating too. Have a nice day. Goodbye.
Goodbye.